This week's parsha is Parshas Devarim. Parshas Devarim begins the book where Moshe gives his final speech. And Moshe starts off his speech by giving the Jewish people a rebuke, in a manner of speaking. The verse states that these are the words that Moshe spoke, and then it lists a long list of exactly where Moshe said these words. And there is really no need to go through such lengthy alliteration of exactly where it was, in between which mountains, across from where, how far away from here. And the reason why all of these markers are mentioned, Rashi says, is because each one of those places is a reference, a hint, to a place where the Jewish people sinned. And Rashi explains the reason why Moshe only hinted to them is because since his purpose was rebuke, he didn't want to embarrass the Jewish people too much. He just wanted to remind them and give them a cautionary tale about the future, that they shouldn't repeat these sins. So therefore he made reference to them and they would understand what he meant. That's why the verse is stated so. Now the problem with this, a very big problem with this, is that in the next just couple of verses, Moshe starts to say very explicitly what the Jewish people did wrong, and in very strong terms. And it seems that Rashi, that comments here that Moshe was worried about the Jewish people feeling embarrassed, therefore he only hinted to them, seems to entirely ignore the fact that just a couple of verses later, it says in a long set of verses many of the things the Jewish people did wrong in the desert, and it describes them in great detail. And Moshe is very strong in his rebuke of the Jewish people. So what's the difference? Why over here in the beginning of the parsha, at the very first verse and the second verse, it states them only in a hint, just, you know what I mean, but I'm not going to go through every detail. And then all of a sudden it goes back over everything. It seems to go through every single last thing they did wrong with a very strong rebuke. What's the difference? What changed? So if you look at the first verse, it starts off by saying, Eila hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. These are the words that Moshe spoke to the Jewish people. These are the words that Moshe spoke to the Jewish people. Well, in fact, the entire Torah is what Moshe spoke to the Jewish people. He told us the Torah. So what does it mean? These are the words that Moshe spoke. And at the conclusion, right before it goes through the delineation of exactly what they did wrong with a strong rebuke, the verse states, and this is at the end of at the third verse, it says, Diber Moshe el b'nei Yisrael k'chol asher tziva Hashem ma'isa aleim. Moshe spoke like all that Hashem had commanded him. So, what exactly is going on over here? First it says, these are the words that Moshe said. It gives the hints to all the different places that the Jewish people sinned. And then it says, these are the words that Moshe was commanded to say. And then it goes through a very detailed description of the sins that the Jewish people committed. So, the Re'aim, who's a commentator on Rashi, explains that Moshe over here was clustering all of the sins that Jewish people did in one spot in the beginning. He was saying that you sinned with the spies, you sinned with the man, you sinned with the slav, with the birds that came down from the heavens, you complained about the man, you said you wanted to go back to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, and he listed everything together, but he did it very, very, very carefully. He only hinted to them. But then when he went back over again, and he went through each one slowly and deliberately, that's when he was stronger in his rebuke. So the Re'aim, even though he doesn't say this entirely, I think what he means to say, to explain, is that Moshe wanted to show them what we like to call the Bria Chatichai, the innermost pole, meaning what was going on over here. What was the reason why all of these sins happened? What it is, there's a series of what we call tests in the desert where the Jewish people fail in certain respects and sin in the eyes of Hashem and are punished therefore. They're punished with staying in the desert for 40 years, not entering the land of Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel. What was the common denominator here? And that is what Moshe wanted to cluster them all together. But at the same time, Moshe was very careful not to throw it all on them at once, because they would have rejected the rebuke immediately, because it would be too much for them to handle. So in order to show them that all these sins have one root to some degree, Moshe had to hint to them very, very, very slightly, so that his rebuke would be heard, so the Jewish people would receive that discipline and take it as a lesson for the future. That's why the first verses that say these are the words that Moshe spoke says all of the various sins very quickly, very briefly, and only in a very in a manner which only the listener could understand. Then once he's finished with that, Moshe goes through each one carefully and slowly and deliberately, and not impulsively, not angrily. Moshe is explaining to them carefully now how each sin was brought about. But at the beginning, he wanted to give them a summary of it all so they would see the common denominator and be able to learn for the future how they should act. That is the reason why at first it says all of the sins together, and it says them very quietly, and only that the listeners should be able to understand. And then afterwards it goes through each one carefully, one after the other, because these two things were two separate things that Moshe spoke, and his purpose with each one of these declarations, these parts of his speech, were entirely different. That's the reign. Question on this week's parsha. This week's parsha also says the following words. It says, the verse states that the Jewish people, Hashem said to the Jewish people, Rav lachem sheves bahar hazeh. You have sat too long on this mountain. Penu su'u lachem. It says, go and travel. What is this a reference to? It's a reference to the Jewish people's encampment at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, while they were encamped at Mount Sinai, of course, they received the Torah. They appointed a Sanhedrin, a judicial system. They accomplished many, many accomplishments at this encampment. Very celebrated accomplishments. They became the Jewish people, basically, at Mount Sinai. Still, Hashem says, you have tarried here too long. Rav lachem sheves bahar hazeh. You've been here too long. And Rashi says something truly shocking. Rashi says, in a negative connotation, Hashem was telling them, you have accomplished too much on this mountain. Now it's time to move on. What is Rashi saying? How could it be a negative thing that the Jewish people had accomplished so much on this mountain? As if this is part of the rebuke, which it is part of the rebuke. So the truth is that Rashi is coming from the subject of the chapter. The subject of the chapter, of this part of the speech, is, I'm rebuking you, and I'm telling you that Hashem told you that you've accomplished way too much on this mountain. What is that? What is that supposed to mean? Why is that rebuke? Why is it something wrong? Have a good Shabbos.